In today's video, I have a glossary of watercolor words, a dictionary if you like, so that you can quickly get up to speed and understand what everyone's talking about. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel we talk about all things watercolor, as well as drawing, mixed media, even a little bit of business and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. If you click the little bell icon, you can get notified every time I have a new video for you. I make at least one free video a week here on YouTube on a Thursday with extra content for Patreon subscribers. So it's that weird part of the year, that gap between Christmas and New Year. I'm not even sure what day it is. There was a bit of discussion on a YouTubers forum. Are people watching less YouTube at this time of year? Certainly they are, but is that because creators are making less content? And actually, I'm not working really properly until next Monday, but you know, just thought I'd make you a YouTube video. So here we are. I'm going to give you today, and it's something that's actually on my website, so you don't have to worry about remembering all this stuff. I'm going to give you a glossary of watercolor terms. Now, a couple of disclaimers here. I am going to be looking aside from the camera. I don't normally use any kind of script. When people comment that I'm reading off of an auto cue, it's absolutely hilarious. I don't know how much time people think I have, but I certainly am not scripting every word of my videos. But today I do have to read from a list because it's just too much for my brain to remember. Another disclaimer is that some of these terms have different meanings in the actual dictionary and have different meanings when you're talking about different mediums such as printmaking or oil painting. So don't be coming in the comments and saying, well, you know, the word shade doesn't mean that. The word shade means tone, it doesn't mean colour. What I'm giving you today is the way that people talk about watercolour painting, the terms that they use most often. Some of these are general art terms as well. And sometimes they are ways that professional artists speak, and they're also terms that manufacturers use. Now, it's not my fault if manufacturers don't use a word to its specific dictionary definition. If that's the way it is, if that's how they use it on a tube of paint, then that's what you need to know. So if you're completely new to watercolour painting, or if you just want to get up to speed on some of the more unusual terms, we're going to work A to Z, and I doubt this is every term you will ever need to know, although I can't adjust this video once it's up. Do feel free to tell me what I've missed out in the comments, and that way I can add it to the list on my website. I'll put a link to my website in the description of this video. You can pop over and see a written version of all of these terms. So if you feel sometimes you don't know what people are talking about, let's start from A and get you up to speed with the language of watercolour. So starting with A, we have artist quality. So artist quality simply refers to paints and art materials that are of the highest quality they could possibly be, and indeed used by professional artists. Next we have backgrounds, sometimes called cauliflowers or blooms. These are the hard edges, the strange shapes that can appear in watercolour painting. There are specific reasons that they appear in your painting. You can search my technique videos to find out how to cause them or how to avoid them as you wish. Next we have binder. This is a term that encompasses many different things. There are many things added to watercolour paint. It's not just honey, it's not just gum arabic. There are all sorts of things that are added to the paint to make it flow nicely, to make it stick to your paper, and just to make it perform well. Every single manufacturer has their own recipe. Next we have blending. This generally describes an area of watercolour that's faded out or blended into another colour. So if you see a colour that fades out and out and out till you get to white paper, or one colour that fades into another colour, that is generally blending, but the term is used to describe all sorts of things within watercolour painting. It's one of those terms that has multiple meanings. Next we have block. If you have a watercolour block, and this is different from the word block that is often used in printmaking. If you have a watercolour block, what you have is a pad of paper that has been gummed around the edges in order to prevent all that waviness that you sometimes get when you put water on your paper. Next we have cockling, and I won't be repeating that twice. I suggest you don't Google it, and if you do and you don't get things come up that are male chickens, then that's not my fault. This is also known as wrinkling or sometimes buckling. It's what happens when you put water on your paper and it goes up and down and you get all these bumps appear in it. Next we have cold press. This is your standard type of watercolour paper. It's pressed between cold plates as it's made, and it ends up with a slight bump that aids the distribution of pigments on your paper. Cold pressed paper is also sometimes known as knot. I'll explain more about that when we get to the ends. Next we have cool colours. Now, of your primaries, blue is really the only cool colour, but a cool colour generally is described as one that tends towards the blue-green end of the spectrum. Now on to E, we have earth colours. These generally describe colours that tend to be like browns and ochres, but technically speaking it describes a colour that's actually made from earth, and many watercolours are still made in this way. They do tend, of course, to be the red browns, the browns and the yellow ochres. Coming on to F, we have the word fan. This describes a type of brush that has a flat fanned out surface. I won't be going through every single brush type in here because that would be a whole A to Z by itself, but I am planning a video for you in 2022 that will go through every single type of brush and show you how to use it as well, but I've included a few of the most common ones in this A to Z. Carrying on with Fs, we have ferrule, and that's a difficult thing to say when you're wearing Invisalign plastic braces, as I am at the moment, but my teeth are getting a little bit straighter, so that's nice, isn't it? And a ferrule is the metal part of a brush. In fact, it's that bit at the end that holds the bristles. Carrying on with F, we have filbert. That's a type of brush that is a flat brush, but rather than a square end, it's cut into a curve. Next up we have flat wash. This describes any area of your painting where you have applied the paint flat and even, so there's no graduation and no drying lines. It's one of the hardest watercolour techniques to get right. I've done whole videos on it and it's included in my beginner's watercolour course as well. So that's flat wash. And next up we have fugitive. Now fugitive refers to a paint that fades in sunlight. Many of the paints years ago used to be fugitive. If you've got a colour, for instance, called permanent alizarin, that is because alizarin crimson used to be fugitive, so they have reformulated it to be more permanent. Not all colours can be reformulated and you certainly lose something of the original colour, but most of us don't want colours that fade and most manufacturers don't use them. There are still a few available. Lastly, on the Fs we have full pan. Now full pan are those small watercolour blocks you get, but the slightly larger size. You get tiny ones and you get a little bit bigger, and those are your full pan blocks. Are you still with me? Let's go on to G. So G is for glaze, and a glaze refers to a layer of usually transparent paint that's placed on top of dry underneath layers in order to adjust them. So you might be adjusting the colour, you might be brightening it or toning it down, or you might be adjusting the shade, the tone, the amount of light and dark. This is somewhat different from the word glaze that would be used in acrylic painting or oil painting, where mediums might be added to make things glossy and shiny. But generally speaking, in watercolour painting, it's just a layer of transparent paint used to adjust the colours underneath. Because it's transparent, you can see through it. Next we have gouache, sometimes called designer's gouache. This is a type of opaque watercolour. It's still water soluble, but it's got a lot of body colour in it, a lot more pigment, and it should dry completely flat. It has a very chalky look to it, so it doesn't glow like watercolours, but it does have its own form of chalky beauty. Next we have a graduated wash. A graduated wash, generally they're used in skies, and you might see one where it goes dark and fades out to light, but really it refers to any application of paint that fades from dark to light or from light to dark. Next we have granulation, or sometimes called granulating colours or granulating pigments. These are pigments that are a bit larger, and so when they dry you'll get little speckles in the paint. Some people hate it, other people find it incredibly beautiful. I think they're lovely. I've done whole videos on granulating colours if you're interested to look up more about that. Next we have gum strip or gummed tape. This is a type of tape that is not adhesive. It becomes sticky when wet, a bit like those old-fashioned postage stamps that we all used to lick before COVID, and that became quite a bad idea. I think they'd phased them out before then anyway, hadn't they? So gummed tape is used to stick wet paper down to a board, and this is used in paper stretching, which I'll talk more about later. Lastly, in the G's, we have gum arabic. Gum arabic is a natural substance. It comes from the acacia tree. It's edible. It's used all the time in foodstuffs and on gum tape and those old-fashioned postage stamps too. It's also used in watercolour paints as part of the binder, and you can buy it in a bottle as a separate medium. It, generally speaking, slows down drying time and helps the paint to adhere to the paper. It also dries shiny, so it's useful for lots of things, and I have other videos on this channel that will show you how to use it. For H we have another type of brush, a hake brush, and this is a very rough oriental type of brush that is used not just for watercolour painting. Oil painters love them too. They're kind of rough and ready, they're very large, and they give quite a rough, loose effect. Also at H we have half pan, and those are the tiniest little watercolour blocks that you'll get. So if you're buying a set of watercolour paints, or if you've got a set of watercolour paints, they've either got the little tiny half pan blocks in, or they've got the double size full pan blocks in, and you can always get replacements for those. And unlike brushes, which vary from manufacturer to manufacturer and have no standard sizing, which is really annoying, half pans and full pans are always the same size, so you can swap them in and out between brands, and you can add extra colours to your box. Lastly at H we have hot pressed paper. So hot pressed paper, as its name suggests, is pressed between two hot plates when it's being made, and this gives it a very smooth surface. It's not necessarily the best type of paper to paint on generally for watercolour, but it has some very specific uses. A lot of people like it when they're using pen or certain types of mixed media. Some botanical artists like it too. It's basically as smooth as sketch paper, but as thick as watercolour paper. And it's one of the 3 types of paper surface that you can get watercolour paper in. So at L we have line and wash, sometimes called pen and wash, sometimes called line and watercolour, sometimes called ink and watercolour. It's the process of applying permanent ink to your paper, and then once it's dry, putting watercolours on top so that you can still see the ink lines that you have sketched. It's really useful for very complex subjects. You know, if you had a lot of boats or something like that, a lot of buildings, it can look really, really beautiful. Fantastic for architectural subjects. It can be used in many different ways. You don't technically have to do the ink first and the watercolour second. It also can refer to using dip pen ink, where you just dip in and apply the ink from an old-fashioned nib. But it can also be used for more modern pens, liner pens for example, where you have a more consistent line. So that's line and wash. At M we have mask, and mask simply means to block out an area of your painting. Often before starting, this could be used to block out white areas, or indeed to block out pre-painted areas. So mask just means to block out an area so that the paint that you're applying next can't get on to that part of the paper. Moving on from there, we have masking fluid. This is a type of liquid rubber. It's sometimes also called frisket, and again it's usually applied to mask out white paper, but it can also be used on dried paint. Next we have the word medium. So this generally means a additive or a separate liquid that can be used to enhance or adjust your watercolour painting. The most popular one is gum arabic, but there are others such as oxgall, which can be from animals or it can be synthetic. You also have things that are quite interesting like granulation medium and iridescent medium. All of these can be used to adjust your paints. Next we have the term mixed colour. This is a very vague expression. It sometimes can mean a tertiary colour where all 3 primary colours are included, but it also can speak to a pre-mixed paint in a tube that is not a single pigment, and that is a mixed colour. In other words, the manufacturer has taken several different pigments and made a new colour. Another mixed M is mixed media. So mixed media just means that you're using more mediums than just your watercolour. You're using other things on top. People often ask me, what makes something mixed media? If I use just a tiny little bit of watercolour pencil, if I use a tiny little bit of pen, does that make it a mixed media painting? Not really. Generally speaking, mixed media would be when you use a significant amount of other mediums within your watercolour painting. If it was something like a competition where you were putting work in, or an exhibition, then what would count as mixed media would be entirely up to the exhibition organisers, and you should ask about that before submitting your work. But generally speaking, watercolour is very much enhanced by little bits of other mediums, and so in my mind it doesn't make it mixed media just because you've used a tiny little bit of oil pastel in one corner. So next up with the M's, we have an M that people don't agree with around the world. There are different words for it. So in the UK we call it a mount. It's that square of cardboard that goes around the outside of your painting when it goes underneath glass. In America and some other countries they call it a mat. So in the UK we would mount our work. In the US you would mat your work. Now, contrary to popular belief, a mount or a mat is not there just for decoration. It has a very specific job to do. It holds the painting away from the glass so that condensation cannot form and mould spots cannot ruin your work. You should never frame a watercolour under glass without matting or mounting it first. Lastly, on the M's, we have muddy paintings. So this is a term that's often used by beginners to describe, work that's gone a bit wrong, looks a bit dull, looks a bit murky. We all know how difficult it is to get that beautiful watercolour glow and to get those bright, fresh colours. As soon as that goes wrong and everything starts going a little bit too muted in too many places, then people will apply the term mud or muddy. My painting has gone muddy, I've produced mud, my palette's full of mud, lots and lots of muddy words there. I've done a whole video about avoiding muddy paintings and the causes for them if you'd like to have a look at that one later on. So now we're going on to the ends, and let's start with neutral colour. So a neutral colour is generally one that would be considered a brown, a grey, a beige, and what they all have in common is that they all have all three of the primary colours in. They're those muted neutral colours that can be really hard to mix. So let's talk about not. Not is a word. I used to think it stood for something. I used to think, well, what does it stand? What's the N and the O and the T stand for? It's a type of paper. All it stands for is not hot press. So this is the same as cold press paper. So your medium surface of watercolor paper, if your hot press paper, which is your smooth, you have your medium surface, which is slightly bumpy. It's called cold pressed, but it's sometimes also described as not. If you buy a standard pad of paper, there's not much written on it, not much, you will find that that is not watercolor paper, also known as cold pressed. There's one more paper surface to talk about, and we'll talk about that when we get to the R's. So onto the letter P, we have pan paints. So pan paints are the small little blocks that you buy as opposed to watercolor tubes. Permanent. Permanent is a word that denotes a stable pigment. So as I said, some fugitive or fading colours have been reformulated to be called permanent. So if you buy a colour called permanent rose, that's because it used to fade very, very badly and it has been reformulated. As I said, you can't remake a natural pigment, so often other pigments are used to approximate the colour that used to fade. You will also find permanency ratings on most tubes or pans of paint, or you can look on the manufacturer's website and those will tell you how permanent your paints are. Most manufacturers, only use fairly permanent, but there's still a difference between the most permanent colours and some that are slightly less permanent. So that's what the term permanent means in regards to watercolour painting. Primary colours. So primary colours in terms of artists' colours are red, yellow and blue. Now there are different primary colours for printers and there is another set of primary colours for scientists who are looking at levels of light. I've gone into that in depth in other videos, but as far as artists are concerned, because we have to be able to mix pretty much every colour, we need to start with yellow, blue and red. However, be aware that there are certain single pigment, natural pigments that come from nature that simply cannot be replicated by mixing the primaries together, which is why it's a good idea as a more experienced artist for you to buy a few extra tubes of paint. I am giving you permission to buy all of the colours. Let's look at the word portfolio, not specifically a watercolour term, but the term portfolio has two meanings. So first of all, it can talk about a body of work. You might submit a portfolio, for example, to get a college place on an art course. But the word portfolio also refers to one of those big flat cases that you carry your stuff around in. If you've got a large sheet of watercolour paper, and if you're short like me, I suggest you don't get a portfolio that's bigger than about A2, otherwise you're going to find it scrapes on the ground. Next we have the term pure watercolours, pure watercolourist. This is a term, it can be quite snobby actually, and it talks about the pure way of using watercolours. In other words, not using any white paint, only using transparent colour. A lot of watercolourists will insist that this is the only way to paint, this is the traditional way to paint. Actually, they're completely wrong because the earliest watercolourists used body colour, they used white paint. That doesn't mean that it's wrong to paint in a way that keeps your watercolours completely transparent. It's all a matter of what sort of effect you're looking to achieve. But we really can't claim that pure watercolours go back to the earliest watercolourists because, as I said, people like Turner, they all used white paint. Now for R we have a rake. That's another type of brush. This is a flat brush that has sort of gaps in the end, so you get this almost rake-like effect. It's used for all sorts of things, including fur and grasses, and you can get them in other shapes too. It's a really useful brush. However, you can make your own with a pair of scissors and a bit of inclination for chopping things. I've shown you how to do that in other videos. I'll probably include it in my brush video coming soon. Next we have the term reserved or reserving your paper. This just means to block out an area of your paper. It's pretty much the same as mask. So in its simplest form, to reserve something can be as simple as just, drawing around it and saying, well, I'm not going to paint on that area, or it can be using physical masks such as tapes and masking fluids. Next we have rigger, another type of brush. So it's a very thin, very small, very narrow brush, but unlike other brushes, it's much longer. So it's a very, very long, narrow, thin brush. It was originally designed to paint ship's rigging, but now people tend to use it for things like grasses. I can't say I use one very often, but if you like them, they're pretty useful. Now onto rough, we have our third paper type. Our third paper type is rough. It's just as easy as it sounds. It's just paper that's a bit rougher. It may stop you doing quite as much detail. It's very much loved by loose painters and people that paint landscapes. It's very good for getting that dry brush technique where the paint skips over the paper and leaves little gaps. If you like a loose painted technique, then rough paper can be great. It also has a tendency to make the pigments look very beautiful. The flatter your paper is, the less beautiful the pigments are going to appear because they're not going to reflect quite as much light. And our last R is round, for round brush. Now this is not the shape of brush that you would imagine it to be. You would think it to be a round brush, but it's not. It's actually the standard type of brush with the pointed end. So if you ever, get a graphic or a picture of a paintbrush, that's the type of brush I'm talking about. It's your standard brush that you would do the majority of your watercolour painting with. So we're on the home run now. Let's go on to the S's, and we're starting with scrubbing out. Scrubbing out simply means to remove paint from the paper, usually after it's dry. It would typically be done with a rag, a stiff brush, or something like cotton wool, and you would scrub at the paper with a little bit of water and lift some of the pigment out, and the thickness of the watercolour paper hopefully would stand up to that kind of abuse. It can also be used not just to correct mistakes, but also for specific techniques. Also with S we have secondary colours. So secondary colours are made when you mix any of the two primaries together. That gives you 3 different combinations if you work it out. So you have orange, green and purple. Those are your secondary colours. Still in S's, there are lots of S's. We have semi-opaque. Now watercolours are considered to be a transparent medium, but some are more transparent than others. They really do vary quite a lot. Some can be really almost opaque, and these tend to be called the semi-opaques. Often they're the cadmiums, but there are other colours which are notorious for being very, very opaque. An example would be Naples yellow. The Potter's colours also are rather chalky and rather opaque. Some of those colours is very hard to see where watercolour sort of meets gouache. There's a definite overlap. Shade, let's talk about the word shade. So this is the one that somebody had a big row with me in the comments over once. Now the word shade is used by paint manufacturers to denote which end of the colour spectrum a certain colour tends towards. You might, for example, have ultramarine green shade. You might have phthalo blue red shade. It's telling you which end of the spectrum it is close to. Now I understand that if you look up the word shade in the dictionary, it does not refer to hue or colour in any way. I'm just telling you the way that the manufacturers use the word. Don't shoot the messenger, because the messenger's just going to delete your troll comments. Next up we have split, in other words split primary. So a split primary set is a set that contains all 3 of the primary colours with a cool and warm version of each. So you would have a blue, a red, a yellow, and you would have a warm and cooler version of each of these. They might sometimes include other things. A gouache split primary set, for instance, would also include black and white. A watercolour split primary set might also have the addition of a few things like earth colours. And a split primary set is a great place to start because it enables you to mix a very wide range of colours. It will never enable you to mix every colour you ever need, but it's a great place for a beginner to start. So do stay with me, we're very close to the end now, and spoiler alert, there's no Z. If you can think of a Z for watercolours, drop it in the comments. So next up we have staining colour. So a staining colour refers to certain pigments that have very small granules, and they tend to sink very deeply into the paper. They are typically very strong and rich. To know if you've got a staining colour, just paint it on your paper. You'll soon recognise them. They look a lot like ink, and as their name suggests, they're very hard to remove from the paper. They're also the same pigments across brands. In other words, all phthalos are staining colours, no matter which brand. All Prussian blues tend to be staining colours, and there are other examples as well. And I have other videos that talk more about this, but a staining colour typically is a strong, transparent colour that doesn't lift out easily. Next, for the S's, we have stretched paper or paper stretching. So this is something that I do with all of my work, and what I do is I stretch the paper onto board before I use it. It's a bit of a misnomer actually, because you don't actually stretch the paper. What you do is you wet the paper, you allow it to expand, you tape it down with your gum strip, not your adhesive, because it won't stick well to wet paper. And then as it dries, it shrinks back, and this keeps it pretty much as flat as a board. It may wrinkle a little bit while you're painting on it, but it will always go back to completely flat. I have lots of other videos explaining about paper stretching, and I have one video that takes you through the process from start to finish. It's a little bit to think about, but actually once you get the hang of it, it's incredibly quick and easy to do, and in my opinion gives you the best surface to paint on. Finally, in the S's, we have students' quality. So we talked about artist quality, now we have students' quality. So these are paints and materials that are almost as good as artist quality. Often with the students' quality paint, all that's happened is that some of the more expensive pigments have been swapped out and a little bit more binder or fillers have been used, but that doesn't mean that they're terrible. You know, students' paints have a really bad name. If you're on a budget, if you pick one of the good manufacturers and you go for the students' range, they really are very, very usable, and they are head and shoulders above those cheap sort of stationers, drugstore paints that you might otherwise be tempted to use. And you'll find indeed in the students range that it's only certain colours that they replace, because those are the expensive ones. So if you are on a budget and you're being a bit smart, you can figure out which are the pigments that aren't quite as good and just buy the artist's version of those and maybe stick to the students in the other colours. So for our only T, we have tertiary colours. So tertiary colours, technically what they are is a secondary colour and a little bit of a primary colour, or the other way round. So they are your muted colours. So let's go for W's, and with W we have warm colours. So a warm colour is any colour that tends towards the warm, that's the red-yellow end of the spectrum. Now we have a term that's thrown about a lot on watercolour painting forums, and it really doesn't have much meaning at all, and that's the word wash. So a wash really is just an application of paint, often over a fairly large area. People talk about applying a wash. Sometimes they're talking about layering. Oh, that needs a wash of colour. Start by applying a wash. As I said, it's a bit of a wishy-washy term, and it doesn't really mean very much. It just talks broadly about applying paint, usually over a fairly large area. And lastly, in the W's, we have wet into wet. Now in the UK, it's called wet into wet. I've noticed that in the USA, it's often called wet on wet. It's basically the process of applying wet colour into other wet colour. So in other words, you might have one colour on a surface and add wet paint to it. It also talks about blending two wet colours together, possibly starting on a dry surface. Again, I've had arguments about this in the comments. You know, there are no watercolour police. Wet into wet, generally speaking, means one wet colour applied on top of another wet colour, but to my mind it also speaks to blending two wet colours together. And it's sometimes used to describe that beautiful effect you get within watercolour painting, where colours sort of blend together and you can still see both of the original colours, and you also get other colours where they overlap. Now if you worked wet into wet and you just blended, if you had say red and blue, you just end up with a flat area of purple. So it takes a bit of restraint to get a beautiful wet into wet technique. So I think I need a cup of tea after talking about all of those watercolour terms. Do let me know in the comments if you think I've missed any, and as I said, I'll add them to that page on my website if you'd like to look at that link, or grab one of my free downloadable PDFs. I've even got a free watercolour course for you. Just click the down arrow and have a look in the description of this video. And if you are watching this video when it's just come out, then I'd like to wish you a very happy new year and look forward to seeing you all in 2022 with lots more painting and drawing videos. If you are brand new to watercolour painting, then do have a look at one of my other videos that will get you started from the very, very beginning. I'll put one of those videos up for you right now.